Welcome to What's Your Point with Colin Barnes and Graham Mills. In this series of podcasts, we will use a famous statement or quote from the world of sport to start our conversation and bring light to a topic. Our goal is to dispel myths and make the truth stick. Come join us in the discussion. Today, we will be taking a look into the dichotomous debate of nature versus nurture and how that relates to innate talent, potential markers, and the ways in which we predict potential. The quote comes from Mark Harrison in 2015 during a podcast in which he discusses the term whispering talent about the players at West Bromwich Albion, where he was the academy manager and the developer of talent. Let's hear what he had to say.
We call about whispering talent, so that's the phrase that we would use for some of these players, that even though we've always felt that they've got potential, that they've been whispering, and now, hopefully in the next year, 18 months, talent.
All right, hi Graham, how are we doing?
Very well, thank you.
All right, today we are going to be talking about Mark Harrison's quote and interview and kind of reference to the West Brom Academy success, where he talks about whispering talent that raises its voice. And so in the audio from iHeartRadio, he referenced that the production points from the EPPP came back at that time, and West Brom was fifth on the list for their productivity, meaning they are allowing a lot of their homegrown youth players to get minutes. And so especially with them being where they are in the landscape of all the money in England, that's a pretty impressive thing. But before we get to that point, we want to do a couple updates. First, let's make sure that we give a shout out to our super fan, Martin Todoroff. He's had some great comments about this podcast, and we want to make sure that everyone is aware that there is a comment box below, and we're going to be using that as for your ability to communicate with us on future podcasts. So at present moment, we have created or planned on roughly 6 or 7 podcast, and we want to give the opportunity for you to have some input on topic areas that interest you. So at the bottom of this video, please make sure you can use the comment, share some ideas that you'd be interested, or even just your opinion. So again, thank you for Martin for some kind words. So let's get back into today. Nature versus nurture. Where are you?
Yeah, it's been an ongoing debate in sport, this one, and I think the simple probably answer is it's a combination of the two. There's been some emerging scientific research in recent years around the environmental influences or experiences and how they can affect the expression of someone's genes, the gene marker, called epigenetics. So it's the research looks at genes aren't fixed. So we're born with sort of expressions of genes, and they're not fixed, so they can change. They can be turned on or off depending on our environment, our experiences. So it's no longer a debate of nature versus nurture. It's probably the two. So if we're in a conducive environment to stimulate these genes and turn them on, then we're going to benefit from that. However, conversely, if our training programs are the environment that we create is detrimental, then it can maybe turn some genes off that are linked to sporting success or athletic capacity. So yeah, there's ongoing research in this field. Our understanding of it is still very, very young in terms of years of knowledge of this sort of concept. However, I think, if I take myself back to when I was at college and school, it was very much a nature versus nurture. It wasn't both. It was one or the other, and we looked at fast twitch muscle fibers, slow twitch muscle fibers, why certain athletes from certain parts of the world are the best in their sport. And probably now, 20, 25 years on, we're now at a point where actually it doesn't need to be this competition between the two. It's probably a combination of both. And I know you've got a paper that you've read in terms of going into this in a bit more detail, which the students hopefully will read ahead of the seminar on Tuesday.
Yeah, the compulsory reading, the paper that you're talking about is the Baker and Wadey, and there is there's many models on how talent gets developed, and there's only a finite amount of people who can become talented. Talent is specific to the domain of the sport. So if we take a look at, I think we got in the discussion earlier about racehorses. So if we say, nature doesn't exist, well, all we have to do is go, what? Why do horses breed certain successful, fast horses? There's lineage that people look at, and you go, well, therefore it definitely works for horses, so it must be true. And we have to remember that the specificity of the sport matters to how much of the gene or the athletic ability or athletic potential of someone is being played. So obviously with horse racing, we're talking about how fast can you sprint, and when it is very specific to just the athletic ability, then absolutely that nature absolutely is crucial and is a part of the full potential. But then we have to look at other sports, and so it may not be true. The more complex the sport becomes, the more skill that is required to develop it. So, just because the signature violinist in the world has a child with another extremely gifted celloist, that doesn't mean that their child is naturally gifted to play an instrument of that degree. The same as we put Usain Bolt and he goes out and onto the football pitch and he's gone on his trials. He's not guaranteed to be a successful footballer just because we know he's the fastest human on the planet. And so we first have to look at the sport in the domain. So obviously football is complex in different things. And then we have to look in, now the research is starting to go, well, you know what? Each position is actually quite specific in the ideal, body type or, person type. So obviously center backs are going to be typically unless they're Fabio Cannavaro, they're going to be the tall, great in the air type center backs. And hopefully that changes as we go. But that has been the typical, the fast winger, the very fit fullbacks. So those all kind of, determine this, talent that we seek.
Yeah, I think there was some research in 1970. Bouchard did some research on twins and separated at birth. One grew up in one part, so the Minnesota twin experiment, I think it was called. So one would grow up in one part of the country, possibly with a certain type of foster family, and the other one would grow up in a completely different area with perhaps a different support network, different family background. And when they actually did the research on some of their behaviours, their characteristics, their personality, they were very alike. However, there was some differences that were found. Their sort of response to tasks, for example, some might get a real quick, early response and be quite successful quite early, and some might take a lot longer. So essentially, in terms of gene makeup, very, very similar. But it sort of, again, that nature versus nurture debate was there, and what they found was that behaviourally, characteristically, personality-wise, they were essentially very, very similar, but there were some nuanced sort of differences based on the fact that they grew up in different environments. So it is a debate that's been rumbling on for many years, and it's started to now filter into sport and the effects of nature versus nurture, with more knowledge now around the EPPP and what an elite environment looks like and what are the factors of elite development. We're becoming more and more conscious of this, but it is an interesting discussion.
Well, look at the different departments within a football club.
Yeah.
So you're doing a trial list for your 14s. They come onto your team from another club, and we have we have a medical department, we've got the sports scientist, and everyone is trying to do this predictor. Is this player going to be good enough? Are we going to get a return if we take them in?
Yeah.
And if we take from what Michael said last week or 2 weeks ago, and go, well, Man City's spending 80 million, was it?
Yeah.
Whatever it is, some ungodly number. Well, then absolutely, they want to know with as much certainty as possible, is this player going to reach the potential that we expect them to, and can we find out? So we've got all these different, as you said, these markers. We're taking muscle samples, we're taking gene samples. We are trying to, as much as we can, figure out where is this person going to be with, and I don't want to steal the thunder on growth and maturation, but when someone breaks their ankle during their pubescent years, when they do the X-ray, you can see where bones are, and you can then go, okay, well, based off of their parents being this tall, and we can see where their bones and everything's aligned, we can now estimate that they're going to be this tall, and yet we're using that information to go, sorry, mate, we don't think you're going to be good enough. Lionel Messi, sorry, in order for you to be a professional, we're going to have to give you growth hormones to make sure that you are tall enough and whatever to see fit. There is so much money at trying to predict these things.
Yeah, and there's some models that academics have come up with in terms of potential predictors of talent in football. And predominantly they look at the physical, sociological, physiological and sort of psychological predictors. There's very little in there around technical and tactical predictors of talent, which is interesting if we go back to the conversation a couple of weeks ago about Arsene Wenger and his belief that by the age of 14, if they've not developed technical prowess, they're not going to be football players. But yet when you look at the talent ID models, there's very little mention of technique and tactical characteristics in there. So I guess you could look at it one of two ways. Does that mean that talent, or from a technical perspective, is very subjective, and it depends on the philosophy of the club and what you're after in terms of a profile of a player? Or do these models assume that technique is done, the foundations are in place, and then we build upon that with the other four corners? Because Williams and Riley 2000, their model, the only mention of technique is just the broad term technical skills. That could fit any sport, and it probably can be used across many, many sports. And then Kelly in 2012, again, probably more of a structured framework with a lot more things in there. But again, the only things that are mentioned are passing, shooting, touch and dribbling. But probably 4, if not 5 times the amount of the content within that model is psychosocial stuff. So, yeah, models do exist, and clubs have taken these on, amended them, and come up with their own models for assessing and selecting talent. But the assumption is that the technical predictors are either being overlooked or just assumed as being, if you're in an elite pathway, there's an assumption there that they've already ticked the box on technical. So yeah, it's interesting when you actually look at the models that are being used.
Yeah, it's a case of you talked about, it's either assumed that it's good enough or it's not a predictor. When we take a look at most scouts, most talent ID and recruiters, there is a general statement, and we can all hear it in our heads. We've all probably said it at some point, where it's, I'll know it when I see it. Or, you hear the comments about Wayne Rooney, whoever, Marcus Rashford, and you go, I knew they were going to be, great when I saw them at 10 years old. They always had that ability. And we make these assumptions. Yes, these people are very talented. They had exceptional abilities at that time. And they clearly made it in the end. So we jump to this, well, it was obvious from the beginning, therefore nothing happened along the way that prevented them from doing it. It was preordained, it was destined, and we have this mental image of, and I'll hit you with some philosophical knowledge here, all right? Plato, the Republic. Everyone's going, Plato, holy cow. Yes, the guy, and he in the Republic, he talks about Socrates. So he uses Socrates' voice, and I say Socrates just based off of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure. I mean, if you can't reference that in a podcast, then you're not doing a good enough job. You're not even trying. So in the Republic, he talks about this class system in this ideal state. You're going to have a class system of 3 different types of people. You've got the guardians, you've got the auxiliaries, and then you've got the producers. And those are fixed. The producers are your workers. They're going to be crafting things, making things. They're your bottom of society. Then you've got your auxiliaries, your warriors. They protect everything. And then you've got your guardians, and they are the elite of the elite. Exactly is what we are suggesting now. I think what we said, the very small percentage from our talk last week, and that's who it is, and we know it from the beginning. And there's this, obviously it's a bad assumption that it's fixed and it can't move, it can't improve, and yet we do that when we spot a player, and then we assume that they're just going to be amazing. There's so many variables, so many experiences that could have derailed that player. So when we think about the Wayne Rooneys or the Marcus Rashfords right now, I'm not a Man United fan, so I apologize for everyone who thinks that I've just given 2 Man United success stories. It is a case of those are exceptions to the rules. Those are the one-offs that, yes, it did work, but there are so many more players that it did not.
Yeah. I think even if we just look at it at pure numbers, I think Michael Calvin quotes 0.012% of players make it. Now, we've got to put that one into context because he's talking about Premier League, the elite, the top level player, and he's also involved in that number everyone that plays football, like every sedentary player, grassroots on a weekend. So the number is 0.012%. If we actually dig down into the numbers a bit more deeper, of 12,500 players that are in the academy pathway year to year, it's 0.5% that make it. So we're still talking less than 1% of the players. So the ones that you've mentioned there, and you've said they're the exception rather than the rule, we're looking at a number of less than 1% that actually make it through the pathway and then become a professional.
And that should be even less if we consider all the academies from the rest of the world, because we know that a lot more players are playing in the Premier League from outside of those academies than from inside. So it's still a staggering number, and proves the point that we can talk about elite, we can talk about innate talent. You can have an assumption. Let's assume just for now that yes, when someone is born, they are destined to be this. There's only a few people that can get to that. They are going to make it to the top of the mountain. They are the exceptional. Well, if we take the other account and say no one is exceptional, and there is no such thing as innate talent, and everything that people accomplish is based off of their own experience and the environment that they put themselves or were put into. And people are still going to get to the top. They're still going to be the elite. And there is no factor that we should be looking for other than that individual created their destiny for themselves by the work they did, by the decisions they made. So there's going to be elite regardless, whether in both instances. People are going to make it, and we have to decipher why did they make it. And I think to your point, yes, we can agree that some people have dispositions physiologically based off of their genetics from mom and dad. There are some psychological genetic factors that also kind of get ingrained. Then there's the whole host of environmental factors. And what we need to get to is where we have the coaches that believe in behavioralism. I'm going to create an environment that produces certain results, and I'm going to give stimulants and responses to get different behaviors. They need to go, some people are born with this or that is different than others, and we need to get our sports scientists, our hardcore naturists to say, yes, there is a starting point that everyone has, but then we do believe in training factors, meaning we can improve the body by training in a certain way. We obviously believe that there is detraining. When you stop training something, you become worse at it at a significant difference less than and how long it took you to get to that point. So behavioralism does work for the hard scientists. So we meet in the middle where, yes, both are working together.
Yeah. And I think just if we go back to the numbers of that 0.5%, there was some research done by the PFA that by the age of 21, 75% or more of those players have actually dropped out of the professional game. So it's difficult. You use the analogy of climbing the mountain and getting to the top. People assume, maybe through social media and the pictures of Messi and Ronaldo scoring wonderful goals, and they don't see what's going on behind the scenes and the hard work and sacrifice and setbacks and trauma and all those things, that once you get to the top, you've cemented your place and it's fine. Yeah. Well, actually, 75% of those players that actually do get there within 3 years of actually getting a pro contract are suddenly, the attribution rate of them dropping out of the game is significantly quite high. So we saw a piece in the media this week about Sam Magri, who was a professional at Portsmouth. He was quoted as saying he learned more in non-league football than he did in the under-23 setup, because it didn't replicate football at the top end. It was friendly games. It didn't. There wasn't win or a loss. There wasn't a bonus at the end of the game. There wasn't points on the board. He found it quite a sterile environment. And when he actually then got deselected and dropped out of the game, went to non-league, he felt as a player he developed so much more than what he did in the academy pathway. And that's a one-off. That might not be the same for every player, but again, it begs the question of, is the model that we've got here really diverse and provides enough differentiation that we aren't losing players like Sam Magri, and he needs to drop down the levels to actually develop, because 75% of players dropping out by the age of 21 is quite a damning figure, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it speaks to, one, that we have so many teams underneath that there is going to be a filtration system that occurs. I mean, you take a look. The American system is, you've got multiple teams at a certain age group, and eventually it filters into just one team. And the same thing's happening. It's kind of, we could use that analogy with the youth national teams. So you've got all these different players coming through at each of the age groups. But then when you look at the full national teams, well, it's everyone. So yeah, someone might have been successful, but they never actually made it. So the numbers wise, we create so many teams, and yet we only have so many that can fulfill that. Had a good discussion with one of our students this week, asking about the loan system. Why aren't players being loaned out to outside countries? And that would help. This would go into the same argument that instead of playing in the 23s in the Premier League, too, then they should go and get experience at a lower division, maybe go into the Portuguese league or any number of the secondary, what we would consider, unfortunately, the secondary leagues. And it absolutely should. There becomes this systematic decision, this, what you said, the structural. Have we created the right structure and format for this to occur? So, one, because of Chelsea, loaning out too many players and stockpiling, we've got rules against, how many loans and things like that. We've got this idea that individual players on the 23s, if there's a chance right now in COVID, how many players from Liverpool had COVID within a week? So we've got Van Dijk getting injured. So there is room for opportunities if you're in the 23 setup that you could get called in very quickly. So there's probably, from the individual standpoint, I kind of want to stick around here, even though the game might not be important. I'm not guaranteed to have whatever, but I could. And that opportunity and this idea that I don't want to go to a lower league when I have the potential to play in the Premier League. Yeah. So it could be changed. It could be the way for others. And it's a great thought. I mean, other leagues don't have the 23s. They just let their second teams play in the lower leagues, and that seems like a great model, especially with what's going on with the EFL and all the clubs that are going to be struggling financially. And someone could say, you know what, instead of bailing them out from the Premier League, let those clubs fail, and that way we can put our second teams into the lower leagues and fulfill those spots. So actually, we don't actually lose any teams. Yeah,
it's an interesting one, the 23s, because there are some merits to it, but there's definitely some setbacks, and we've seen players going abroad. Sancho being an example that we've used a lot because he's very current at the moment. But certainly his growth and development has just been exponential since leaving England and going and playing in a competitive league.
And then we could use the opposite example. Eric Dyer, didn't he? He was was he in Spain before he came back?
He grew up in Portugal.
Portugal, that's what
it is. So he played in Portugal before coming over. I think he may have even had a trial at Everton. I think I seem to remember at a younger age. But yeah, the under 23s is a conversation in itself. I think one of the benefits is that it gives clubs more time. So they're not now having to make a decision at 18. They've now got those extra years where if you've got a late developing player or a late bloomer or that whispering talent that we heard the quote from West Brom's academy manager, we're giving more time for that. So I know we're going to come on and talk about growth and maturation in coming up weeks, but there's some very recent research by Megan Hill. She's had a look at selection bias in academies. So early maturation sort of emerged to be or affect selection bias at under 12s, and then every year group after that it increased. So the bias only got deeper and deeper. And in her research, she found that actually 0% of the under 15s and under 16s age group could be categorised as late maturers. So at the top end of academies, even though we've got the under 23s, which gives us now more time, so we can offer a first year pro or a scholarship to a player if we know that he's not quite there yet, but he's still got a few more years. The research would suggest that perhaps we're not actually using that because we've still got this early maturation bias. And then linked to that, she did a secondary study on coaches' evaluation of performance. So coaches were asked to like on a 4-point Likert scale, we're asked to grade the players each game. So after at the end of each game, they graded them from 1 to 4. And at under 12s, the grading was significantly lower. Again, we've talked in previous episodes about 13.2 to 14.8 being the sort of sweet spot of growth and maturation when peak height velocity occurs. So as they're starting to come into that pre-growth spurt stage of their development, their grades significantly drop, and then they eventually increase post-growth spurt. So at 15s, they then suddenly go up again. Mm-hmm. So actually, what we're assessing is not potential at all; it's performance, because we're not actually looking beyond the adolescent growth and the awkwardness and the difficulties they might have on mechanical movements and the effect that they might have on the technique. We're not able to actually look beyond that and say, well, actually, when it all falls into place, that player is doing the right things, he's getting in the right positions, and grading them based on potential. We're actually grading them on performance, because when they come into this pre-growth spurt period, their scores take a nosedive, and when they come out the back of it at 15s, they then shoot up. So again, as coaches, we're probably not taking maturation status into our evaluation, and what we're actually doing is making an early assessment on performance, which is a bit worrying, given that if an under 12 is in an academy, I think the average age of a Premier League appearance is 23, so 11 years time, if that player actually makes it through the pathway, is when they're going to be making their debut on average. Yeah. But yet we're giving them low scores at under 12s because we're not actually looking at the right things. We need to change our lens and look at potential.
So this leads into two kind of separate branches, which we need to get to. So the first one, and we'll come back to it because I know you've done your work with potential factors for full development, is obviously we need to talk about what hinders and what helps and supports future development. But the other side is, especially with this week, we're going into the Cat 3, Cat 4 clubs. So obviously the Cat 4 clubs are going to be taking this mindset of a late developer approach. Yeah. We're going to scrap the FP, the YDP phases, and we're going to focus in on these older ages. And then we have the Brentford example of just going, we're not going to have any academy system. We're just going to have the B team. And so I go back to last week we talked about Michael Jordan. Yeah. And we talked about him as the elite. He is the elite of the elite basketball players ever to play the game. You could tell if we did the nature versus nurture at 16 or at 15, it was not there. He did not have the ability. He was cut. Yet obviously he was a little bit later than others in his development, and clearly his talent came through. Well, going through that story, he had a differing. He went through the exact opposite of what we're talking about. So he was the elite, and then he wasn't the elite. He switched to baseball. Yeah, and he retired in the mid '90s or early '90s for various reasons. And it just so happened, because he was a Chicago guy, he went and signed with, because the owner of the Bulls was also the owner of the White Sox. So he happened to sign with them. And so they sent him down. In the American system, they have a 3-tier system underneath that's attached to their major league team. So they've got single A, triple A, and or double A and triple A farm system. And so as a player, their pathway is, okay, typically you start off, let's say, at the single A. If you improve or players get injured, and you move up to the double A, then to triple A, and then eventually the majors. Well, he started off at double A in Birmingham, Alabama. So we trained the baseball stadium that he played at, the Hoover Met, had a parking lot, and right next to the parking lot was 2 football pitches, which is where we trained. So I got to hear the guy strike out repeatedly. And the stories that you see and hear was, okay, he's this big, tall, lanky guy. the only people, professional baseball players that are really good, that are 6'6" and higher, are pitchers, because they got long arms, great trajectory, they can wing a ball. He wasn't. He was a center fielder. And so the time that it takes to bat, obviously, is at a disadvantage. So he doesn't have the nature to help him.
Yeah.
But at that time, his coach ended up being Terry Francona, who ended up winning World Series with the Boston Red Sox. He's now the Cleveland Indians. So he's obviously a high-end coach, an elite coach. And his recollection and his statements are he was going to make it. Like, he wasn't quite there, but the amount of time he came into this low-funded, Double A is not as obviously as well-funded. It would be considered kind of a Cat 3 club. He had to buy the team a new bus because he wanted to travel in style. He took care of the players on his own salary from what he had made, but his work ethic. He was had bloody hands from being at batting practice, and by the end of the year he was actually quite good. And so there is this idea that it's posing what a Cat 3, Cat 2 club or Cat 4 club would look like, and the other side is how much of it is nurture and how much he had the will. And obviously the quote that we talked about, it's not about the shoes, it's about what you do with it in them. He put in all that effort, and he was a late developer.
Yeah.
Clearly, he took on baseball after 30, I think, or at the end of his prime, athletic stance. But that wasn't his primary, sport. That's not what his genetics. And we talked about talent is domain specific. That wasn't the one. Yet he was making up for it with all this, and as you said, the technique. That there is some development that can occur. And so hopefully that leads into our discussion on potential. And I think you're exactly right about we take snapshots of people and we predict based off of what the snapshot is, not about these other factors.
Yeah.
I think we do that a lot.
And what we're often guilty of doing is taking the adult, so what it looks like at the top end, and then trying to apply that to what we're seeing at maybe under 12s. And obviously the two are very, very different. We can't assess an under 12s player based on what we know we would expect to see or like to see at the first team level. It can't work that way where we just shrink the game down and try and apply it to younger players.
We have to account for late developers.
Yeah.
And that's hard.
And in recent years we've seen, so Tyrone Mings I think is a famous one, where he was at Southampton, got released for being too small, his words, then goes into the non-league system, played for his dad at Chippenham Town, got signed by Ipswich, and by that point he's now 6'5", goes on, plays for Bournemouth, Aston Villa, is now in the England squad. So, if we are making these decisions too early, there's so many examples of those. So Andy Robertson, probably now one of the best left-backs in the world, has won a Champions League, has won a Premier League, was released by Celtic, then had to go to Queen's Park and make it up. And there's a famous tweet about it, he takes a photo of his bedside table with his last bit of money on the side and saying how difficult it is, So there are examples of late developers that, thankfully have been given a chance through maybe a Cat 4 system or dropping down into grassroots and non-league and making their way back up. But, again, they're probably the exception. How many of those late developers don't actually resurface that once they do start to drop, that they've sort of gone from the elite level?
With the people who believe in that nature is the king all, is it just a matter of time before someone who does have the talent that hasn't been spotted yet, if they get into any environment, eventually the cream will rise to the top?
Yeah.
Is that a valid argument?
Yeah, and you touched upon it in our previous episode around sort of the rocky road, and talent needs trauma, so setbacks. So actually, maybe those setbacks are the catalyst that then lead to that rise back up. Who knows? It's such a complex thing, and I don't think it's a perfect science. But there's certainly players that are getting discarded from elite pathways because Perhaps they're too small at a certain cut-off point, and these cut-off points are man-made. We've put these assessment dates in. You've got to sign a scholarship on these dates, so they're all man-made. You know, one player might need 6 months more, and might look a completely different player in 6 months. But because we've put these ceilings on, you know, we are going to lose talent, unfortunately. But yeah, just I think you touched upon it briefly about the sort of potential framework, which I'm happy to share with the guys. So my personal belief is that everyone is born with a certain level of potential. So the definition that I would use of potential is a reality that hasn't been realised yet. And I sort of link it to, I don't know if you've seen it, I don't know if they have a version of it in America, but the £1 million drop. Mm-mm. So you're essentially given this £1 million, and then you're asked questions, and you've got to spread that £1 million over which answer you think is right. And if you answer a question wrong, that money drops, and your £1 million shrinks as you go through the levels, and whatever you're left at the end is the money that you take home. So I see that as everyone's born with this potential, and through the trials and tribulations and experiences that you have, you know, that potential can either be retained or you can start to shed it.
Is everyone's starting position at the same point, though?
No, I think it's all relative, and again, that's where that nature-nurture debate comes in. But everyone has, it might not be, you know, in the £1 million drop, everyone starts with $1 million. It might be that some people start with 750,000, might be that some start with 1.5 million. You know, it's relative, but everyone starts with potential. Mm-hmm. And then I think you've got then external or dynamic elements, the things that can start to shed or chip away at that potential. And I've sort of listed opportunity, so things like birthplace, the sporting infrastructure of your local environment. So if you're, you know, an avid football player but you're in a remote part of the country and there's not a lot of football clubs, then opportunity is not going to be very optimal for you, so you might start to shed some of that potential. So that's opportunity. Then there's environment, so things like support networks, the level of challenge, we talked about trauma. Then circumstance, so socio-economic status, you know, timing, certain biases, and then you've got the internal or personal assets as well, so that's the genetic factors, so like IQ, character traits, heritability of athletic status, those sorts of things. So external factors and internal factors, and then under there you've got the four things: opportunity, environment, circumstance, and genetics. And whatever comes out of all of that is what you're left with as the potential, and whether that's enough for elite, whether that's sub-elite or non-elite. But no one ticks all the boxes. We've all got obstacles and barriers that prevent us from fulfilling our potential and realising it. But I suppose, working in an academy environment now for 10 years, the ones that I look back on and have made it, they're not always the ones that I would have said were the ones that were going to make it. Sometimes they are, a lot of the times they're not. But when I look at it, I probably see a lot of similarities in that they're resourceful, so they tend to make the most of the resources that are available to them. They tend to create workarounds if there's a problem. So if there's a goalkeeper that's 6'1" and the height profile is 6'3", they'll go to the S&C and they'll work on a plyometric program to increase their jump height and stuff like that. So they're resourceful, they come up with workarounds, they're diligent, and they're also sort of innovative. So they come up with different ways. So you see with LARM, so if I'm probably guilty of looking at first team and senior and relating it to youth, but you look at LARM was small, you know, 5'6", I guess. It wasn't very big, but he would drift into midfield as a fullback and play centrally. Certainly towards the latter end of his career, was tactically very aware. So if you don't have the physical capacity that ticks the boxes, are they innovative enough to find a solution? Are they versatile enough to find a solution? So again, resourceful, diligent, and innovative. Usually, if they've got those characteristics, whatever potential they're left with, if after all of these things that they've had to go through, they tend to make the most of that potential. And that's just my own. There's no academic rigour to that. There's no support to that. It's just my own framework that I've sort of produced, and I'm happy to share it with the guys. But I don't know if you've got your own views on that.
No, I wouldn't say I've gone anywhere close to creating a visual, categorize them. in seeing it and working with you through it. It was a fun task to try and put down onto paper and put into words what we've experienced throughout our many years of development. So I like the external and internal, because there's so many factors that aren't placed on the specific athlete, but there are so many things that are controlled by how they deal with things. And I totally agree with you. The one of the biggest factors for ultimate success may not be their technical ability or their physical ability. It is their ability to deal with adversity and problem solve, and have the determination to fight through all of that while it's going on. I was thinking about the people when I came up with the comment about Wayne Rooney or Marcus Rashford. When you saw them, it's like, okay, who would that relate to? Who I've coached? And it was, so three that came to mind was Kelly O'Hare with the women's national team now. Emily Sonnet, who's not as well known, but she was a 90. What was she? She must have been a 92. No, she was a 93. So she was in Atlanta in Georgia when I was coaching there. So we worked together, and she is the most competitive SOB that you can imagine. And on the women's side, it was striking. There was a definite difference that you could notice. But she was a center midfielder as a youth player, and she's now playing, center back for her university. It was at UVA, and then now she's playing right back and center back at the national team level. And you could say she stood out. You didn't know at the time, would she eventually be able to make it happen? She wasn't getting a lot of calls at that time. And on the guys' side, there was Perry Kitchen. So he was on one of our teams in Chicago at 14, so roughly around the same age as Sonnet. And he was the standout, but did everything well. He was a nice guy, and the same thing is competitive. And so you could put him anywhere on the field. You could ask him to lead, and he's had that kind of rocky road that you talked about. Best player, one of the best players coming out of the NFL or the MLS draft. DC United for a bunch of years, went to Hearts, had a bad experience. I think the manager didn't like him. He then had to go to Denmark, and now he's back with the Galaxy. Got some national team experience, but he was exceptional. But he wasn't exceptional above everyone else. That team had, I think 5 different youth national team players at the time. So, he was good. He was captain of the U17s when he was at the U national. I think he went to the whatever World Cup, the U20 World Cup. And you look at those different things that affected them, and it's a case of there's so many things that could go wrong or could be used as a strength. Yeah. And I think you say that everyone's going to deal with adversity. It's kind of how you deal with it. Michael Jordan, we know, took failure as a positive. All these success stories, they have that. Any players from you that come to mind that you've worked with? Yeah,
there's a lot of players that have now got professional contracts and are playing in the league somewhere, whether that's in the Football League or National League. Some have made Premier League debuts, and there tends to be, as well as those things that I talked about, so being diligent, innovative and resourceful, that desire to, they just keep going. So one player was released at under 12s, went into grassroots. We re-signed him at 15. He's now England under 21 international. They've all got a narrative, and in there somewhere there generally is some sort of setback. Very few have got this linear rise that just keeps going upwards and upwards. I would say that's common. I mean, I use the example of Lahm at Bayern because he perhaps doesn't fit the stereotypical fullback in the modern game now, because managers tend to want to have taller fullbacks that can defend back post. But he was tactically unbelievable. He could play left back, right back, play centre midfield. He could play pretty much anywhere, and he used that to his advantage. Now you look at the same club with the same philosophy, and they've now got Benjamin Pavard playing at right back, who's a completely different player. So when we talk about talent, sometimes we're at risk of having these very fixed characteristics and role profiles and positional profiles. Actually, we just need to give a platform to the player in front of us to utilise what they do have, create some workarounds if there are any blockages in their pathway, and give them the opportunity to express that talent that they've got. And if they're good players, Lahm was probably one of the best fullbacks in the world, was in like FIFA tournament 11s and UEFA tournament 11s, consistently one of the best performers in that position, but very different player to Pavard, but they both do the same job for the same club, in slightly different eras. So I think we can pigeonhole players, and certainly that's a problem with growth and maturation, with that pigeonholing and making decisions too early. But yeah, it's a fascinating conversation to have, because we don't know the answers to this. It is really that
it would be so easy. Plato has it. It's so, how simple would it be to go, okay, you are this, you are that. Life is easy when you're able to go, when you know for certain this is the marker of what a left back does. They must have a fitness. So if we say they must be fit, then we can go, well, if you can't run a mile in under 5 minutes, then you cannot play at the elite level of our club. And so we're searching for these yes or no markers that justify our decision, because it's so complicated.
And it's not that objective. So to perform as a fullback, yes, I would agree that in the modern game you need to be able to contribute to attack and defence. You need to get up and down, up and down. However, what if that player doesn't have the endurance capacity to do those repeated sprints constantly throughout the game, but his agility is exceptional? So in 1v1 situations, can change direction, can stop crosses. So he might not. This is the problem with those benchmarks and saying to play you've got to hit this or you've got to achieve this. I don't think it's that black and white. There's a lot of variation.
So if we can't say one has to be there, we create 15 benchmarks, and you have to hit 10 out of those 15. Is that the system we should have?
I think it would be more realistic to have a list of responsibilities that a fullback may have to have, and you check in the ones that player achieves. If you had to attribute a number to it to say that that's what makes them elite, then fine. But I think that's more realistic than say you've got to hit this or else you're not going to be elite. If you said you've got to hit maybe a couple of these, then I think that's more realistic, because then that allows individual difference in the player to perform that role within the characteristics and the attributes that they possess. And it may look different. Me and you playing in the same position is probably going to look very different, because we're different people, different makeup, different sort of physiology. However, you could probably perform it just as well, but just in your own unique way, in your sort of thumbprint.
Which comes back to what we did last week on our values. So you've got your club values, then you've got your own as a coach values that we tried to work into. So the same thing can be applied here with a coach has their profile, what they would prefer, and now you've got all these individuals that you're trying to go, well, I really like this system of play that I know works. We're a football manager. We've all done this. We scour and go, okay, well, what tactic has someone already created that I can plug in and just put players in and we'll win matches? Yeah. Or are you going to create your tactics and the roles and responsibilities based off of the strengths and weaknesses of the individuals that you have?
Yeah, and I think that's where the best clubs in youth development, that's what they tend to do. So I was fortunate to go to AZ Alkmaar a couple of years ago and do a study visit there. And they've inherited this term whispering talent. So they'll do cognitive tests, they'll do certain things that perhaps other clubs aren't doing, and their rationale for it was because Ajax are just down the road. They can't, if they want to go toe to toe with them, they're going to lose that fight all the time. So they've got to look for that whispering talent that maybe isn't obvious now, but in future will be. So they're looking at different ways of assessing talent, and it's a remarkable club. I think they played in the Europa League against Man United last year, and in their starting lineup or their starting squad, they had 10 academy players in there, and year after year they're getting these players through. So maybe we need to look at examples like that and look at what they're doing to achieve that level of success. And if we talked in our very first podcast, we talked about how Barcelona back in sort of 2008 with Guardiola led the way, and I think you talked about a very sort of topical conversation, not only in terms of talent and player development, but also given that El Clasico is today. So yeah, I mean, I don't know if you want to.
Yeah, I mean, looking on the BBC this morning, I wake up, Barca looking like they're going to be playing a bunch of youngsters. I mean, you think about all the players that have left. Vidal left. You've got Suarez that are out, and literally, I'm looking at these names and I'm going, either I haven't watched Barca in a long time, or I just don't know anyone. Like Serginho Dest, Ricky Puig, Ronald Arejo, Pedri, Francis. I seriously, I'm that far behind.
Dest is English. Dest is American.
No way.
Yeah. He's the first American to play for Barcelona.
Oh my gosh. There was he was with the kid that came over a few years ago that kind of got hamstrung with the Messi rule because he couldn't play at the beginning because his whole family moved over. But so what we talked about is the fruition's coming through now. We've got a bunch of crisis. Now we must start playing our youngsters.
The reset button, going back to what they know through their own development, similar to what we talked about with Rijkaard leaving, and there was Deco, Ronaldinho, some big, perhaps underperforming, coming towards the back end of their career at Barcelona. Guardiola came in, having just coached Busquets and everyone else in the B team, and then goes and has a 4-year period of unrivaled success. So maybe they're at that point again.
It's a good thing.
For youth development, certainly, yeah.
And I guess if Real Madrid's not winning in Champions League and losing to a COVID depleted Shakhtar, maybe this is a good time that you feel comfortable. Well, they must be struggling, so this is the moment that we can capitalize. So it all gets tied in. This idea of innate talent. And how do we potentially market? I mean, when you're talking about Alkmaar, I hear can we trust these potential indicators, these tests? Can you test someone's ability psychologically to handle adversity? Is that something that is measurable? And if you do measure it, is that individual exam test assessment? Is that going to really indicate how they're going to do in the future too? Is that just we're taking a snapshot, but we're not actually indicating what they're going to be doing forward? So yeah. I know that doesn't answer the question. I know that asks way too many more questions on the topic. Yeah.
I think the good thing about the examples of AZ Alkmaar is that they're trying to do something different. They're not just following the norm. And a bit like we've talked about Brentford, they've gone with a B team because they could have easily carried on and been a Cat 4 and gone through that way. But it doesn't fit them and their context and what they're trying to do. So I admire clubs that go against the grain and do what they believe to be right. So Will other clubs follow? Will other clubs start to be brave enough to do the same? Who knows? But I do like the fact that they've gone their own way, and it's having success at the moment. Will it continue to have success? Who knows? I think they probably need to continue to evolve and adapt as the game evolves. But I think we can look to those as positive examples for maybe giving talent or viewing talent in a different light.
Thanks for joining the conversation. If any of this has sparked an interest in you, check out our resources in the description below to go and find out about the sources and links to learn more on your own. Here's how you can add to the discussion. First, you can agree or disagree on our position by commenting below. You can engage with others who have stated their stance. And finally, if you have a quote or a topic area that you'd like to suggest to us, please leave us with that information because your opinion matters. May the myths be dispelled and the truth stick.